Dr. Winterbottom is a senior research psychologist supporting with the 711th Human Performance Wing, the U.S. Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine, Department Operational-Based Vision Assessment Laboratory. His most recent research focus on U.S. Air Force vision standards and modernization, the vision screening practices. Okay?
Okay, thank you. Good morning. So I'll talk a little bit about some of our research on vision standards. We use kind of a unique stereoscopic virtual environment to do that work, so hopefully that will be of some interest here in this session. Just a quick disclaimer, these are just my opinions, really. So I work in the Operational-Based Vision Assessment Laboratory at the School of Aerospace Medicine, and what we are doing in large part is modernizing vision standards, really trying to make the connection between our vision standards and how well aircrew will really perform in real-world tasks. So certainly a lot of people have thought a lot about that, but there's surprisingly little actual data to make that quantitative connection between those two things. So that's a major focus of our laboratory. So I'm sure everyone in this room is pretty familiar with depth perception in particular. It can be very difficult to clearly make the connection between the utility of stereoscopic displays for enhancing performance on certain tasks, or similarly, the utility of stereo acuity and how well that, and what difference that makes in certain tasks that may involve depth judgments. If you look at the literature, you'll find very different results across different studies, and it's just been a very difficult issue to kind of tease apart what those contributions are. We do know that binocular vision affects a pretty substantial portion of the population. For 3D movies, for example, a lot more people complain of headaches and things like that than they do for 2D movies. And that's probably due to characteristics of the viewers themselves. So for the Air Force, this is a potential safety of flight issue. We want to make sure in certain occupations that they can make really accurate depth judgments. Or as we presented last year, we're now using remote vision, stereoscopic systems, stereoscopic head-mounted displays. We want to make sure we can select people that can get the most benefit out of those new vision enhancement devices, and they can tolerate using them for long periods of time. For the Air Force, it's a big issue as well, because we can potentially have people wash out of training because they can't tolerate the use of these systems for long periods of time, or for the career field I'll talk about today, they may not perform it that well. Ideally, we'd like to pick those people out ahead of time before we invest a few $1 million in training them only to see them wash out. On the other side of that issue, we don't want to kick people out unnecessarily due to a visual issue when they can actually perform the job well. So that kind of sets up our motivation for conducting this study. This just summarizes what the Air Force vision standards are. So we have a very strict stereo acuity standard. This applies not only to pilots, but to what we call our flying class 3 aircrew, our non-pilot aircrew that have scanner duty. So that applies to boom operators, and it applies to the career field I'll talk about today, which is flight engineers, the people that sit in the back of, in this case, rotary wing aircraft. So we have a very strict stereo acuity standard for this career field. We also do not allow misalignment of the eyes, strabismus or tropias, that's just outright misalignment of the eyes. We do allow a little bit of muscle imbalance, and so that's what phorias refer to, that slight muscle imbalance, and this just summarizes what the limits are for the vision screening for that. So the particular issue we're interested in right now is flight engineers and what their vision standards should be. They have to have really, probably you'd imagine, very good depth perception. So among other things, so they fire the gun, but they also coordinate constantly really with the pilots to clear the aircraft flight path and also to clear the aircraft for landing. So the flight engineers sit in the back of the aircraft here. I don't know if you can see it, but there's someone sitting at this window operating the gun. The pilot sitting up here may not be able to see the ground in a lot of cases. So they really rely heavily on the flight engineers, especially during landing, to call out distance to the ground, look for obstacles, and ultimately clear the aircraft for landing. And there's a lot of communication going on between the flight engineer and the pilots. So this can be a pretty challenging task. The aircraft comes in very fast for landing, especially for combat landings, may be tilted up quite a bit, so the pilot really can't see the ground in a lot of cases. So they are pretty heavily reliant on the flight engineer to make these depth judgments. So you can imagine depth perception could be very important for the flight engineers. So before I get to the research, I don't think I really need to say this in this room, but depth perception is a lot more than just stereopsis. A lot of people tend to equate those two, but there's a lot of other cues like size, motion parallax that you can use to help with depth perception, other cues to depth. And in particular, motion parallax may be an important one, especially in tasks like this where there's a lot of motion involved. Okay, so our objectives for this were to develop an operationally relevant simulation of a landing task, evaluate the contribution of stereoscopic displays to performing a combat landing kind of task, and evaluate the relationship between vision test scores, in particular stereo acuity, and how well people perform on this task. So just kind of very briefly describe the landing task and some of the demands there. It's a pretty complicated task. So for this research, we tried to break it down into more digestible components. So what I'll talk about today is what we call the hover task, and we really kind of selected a task which we thought would be most dependent on stereoscopic viewing or depth discrimination and stereo acuity. And I'll describe that in just a minute. So this is our apparatus. We selected an SA Photonics head-mounted display. We picked that because it has a pretty wide field of view, pretty high resolution, and pretty high quality optics. We were a little bit concerned about introducing artifacts with a lower cost HMD, so we tried to pick one with pretty good image quality and wide field of view. That was combined with a head tracking system. So the apparatus that you see here has a bunch of head tracking cameras. The observer sat in the middle of that, so we could track their head motion during the experiment, and we used that information to update the imagery based on their head position. So as I said, we're trying to replicate as many of the potential cues to depth as are available in the real world in this simulation. So we used X-plane as our image generator, 2 channels separately driving the left and right eyes. Okay. So I apologize, I don't have any real nice 3D imagery of this task. Our lab was hit by lightning and took down our image generators, so I wasn't able to capture some of the imagery for the conference. But this shows what that looks like here from the view of the observer. So they're looking back, kind of hanging out of that window I showed earlier, looking back at this tail wheel. This is our hover task, and we did that at 2 different heights above our obstacle here, which is in this case, it's the flagpole here, or the windsock pole. And so we turned this into a 2-interval force choice task. So the helicopter kind of hovered down into place over the pole, so it was a little bit of motion as the helicopter descended. And then they had to make a choice between 2 intervals. In one interval, they got what you see here, which is the tail wheel directly over the pole. And in the second interval, the aircraft was moved fore or aft relative to the pole. So we're basically measuring their just noticeable difference in depth that they can detect as the tail wheel moves relative to the pole. Okay, so in the paper, there's several experiments described. Just in the interest of time today, I'll focus on the last 2, experiments 3 and 4, which were really comparing the aspects of vision, effective stereo viewing, in doing this task. So these are just some of the results of the vision test. So we used 3 different vision tests. Should I missing a slide here? Oh, there we go. So these are the 3 vision tests we really relied on. Stereo acuity, fusion range, which is a measure of ocular alignment, or how well the quality of their binocular vision, essentially, and motion perception. And so this is what our stereo acuity test looks like. It's a computer-based test. And is that working? This should be a movie here. I don't think it's showing there. There we go. So if you have good motion perception, hopefully you can see an expanding dot pattern there. That was one of the other tests that we used to test all the observers in this experiment. So we presented some similar work last year on our remote vision system area refueling simulation. The stereo acuity test in particular was pretty strongly correlated with how people performed that stereoscopic vision task. So we're using it again for this research. Okay, so I skip back over to the vision test results. So this just shows the range of performance on our vision test. In this third experiment, experiment 3, we had about 40 subjects that participated in this experiment, and what we really set out to do is get as many people across that range as we can, so people with really good visual performance to people with really pretty poor visual performance. So for stereo acuity, we've got people that are better than 20 arc seconds, all the way out to people that have really pretty poor stereo acuity, worse than 800 arc seconds. So we got a similar kind of range for motion perception and ocular alignment as well. So we're really have widely varying capability in terms of vision across our observers. So these are the results of experiment 3. So this just compares the 2 different altitudes. So the altitude closest with the tail wheel closest to the pole and then a little bit farther away, and for stereo viewing and non-stereo viewing. So for close to the pole, when we turn the stereo off in the HMD, they can perceive a change in depth of about 2 meters. When we turn the stereo on, it cuts it almost in half. A similar kind of difference. Everyone performs a little bit worse with the tail wheel a little higher above the pole, but kind of a similar doubling of performance there for stereo off versus stereo on. So stereo viewing clearly makes a difference in this depth judgment task, which we would tend to expect for this type of task. But when we look at the relationship between our vision test and how well people perform this task, we would kind of expect if you're making use of those stereo cues, if you have better stereo acuity, you can probably more accurately judge the distance between the tail wheel and the pole. That actually does not happen. So this relationship or the correlation between stereo acuity test score and how well they make those depth judgments, that correlation is essentially 0, which is a little bit surprising to us at least. We thought that would make a bigger difference. But the other 2, ocular alignment was correlated with performance on this task, at least in the stereo condition. And motion sensitivity was actually correlated pretty well for both stereo viewing and no stereo. So we're kind of interpreting that as they're probably making pretty good use of the motion parallax to help them make those depth judgments for this particular operational task simulation. Okay, so for experiment 4, everything was, the depth judgment was the same apparatus, but we added a low visibility condition. That looks really low contrast up here. It was probably not quite that bad in our simulation. It was about a 10% contrast tail wheel against the background. But this is kind of simulating a brownout or whiteout condition during a helicopter landing. So we're interested in looking at what effect that might have on performance. We didn't get everybody back to come back for this last experiment, so we had about half the number of subjects in this one. So this just summarizes the results very quickly. So stereo vision, again, turning stereo on versus having it off, again, makes a big difference. Similar doubling of performance. Contrast, though, did not have an overall significant effect, but it did seem like it degraded the stereo vision condition, particularly for the 2-meter height above the pole. So we're kind of degrading the utility probably of the stereo condition with the higher height, and then the contrast seems to be degrading that, the use of that cue even more in this case. Okay, so if we look at the relationship again between our vision tests and performance on this task, I didn't have quite as many subjects in this experiment, so we're collapsing across some of the conditions here. But stereo acuity, again, was not correlated with how well people performed this stereoscopic depth judgment task. Fusion range with fewer subjects wasn't quite significant, although one component of the fusion range measure was. So if they have better ocular alignment, they can line up their two eyes together pretty well. That does seem to make a difference. And again, motion is very consistently related to performance on this task, so that seems to be a fairly important depth cue. So just quickly wrap up here. So a stereo display clearly made a difference in this task. Everyone, even with poor stereo acuity, seemed to be able to use stereo displays to perform this task better. In the Air Force, at least, it's not common at all to have stereo displays in training applications. That's due to a number of factors, but these results seem to suggest there might be some benefit for certain training tasks of using stereo displays for certain things. Particularly something like this, you may be able to use ground-based trainers, for example. It's very expensive to do the live fly flights for training applications, so if you can move some of that to a ground-based stereoscopic display system, training system, there's some potential cost savings there. On the vision test, which we're interested in at the School of Aerospace Medicine, stereo acuity was not predictive of this particular task performance. That suggests that we could potentially back off on our pretty strict standard without affecting flight safety and potentially enlarging the pool. Obviously, we have to do a lot more on this before we make that decision, but this provides some evidence for that. Good ocular alignment, though, was very predictive, so our measures of that, all our aircrew have to take a test that's administered by an optometrist to check their alignment. That's probably quite important. Something we don't test right now, motion perception, may actually be pretty important, so that's something we'll be continuing to look at. So we are planning to do some more research on this. As I said, we kind of broke this down into a simpler set of subtasks of the call to landing task. So we're planning to look at time to collision estimates, height above terrain as another subcomponent of the landing task that we'll be looking at. And so we're kind of taking a crawl before you walk before you can run approach to this, then finally go to more like a full combat landing simulation and do a similar kind of analysis. Look at the effect of stereoscopic displays on the performance of a full landing task, and again, look at our vision tests and how that relates to performance on this task. So we're doing this work actually in collaboration with the Army as well as Canada and Australian governments. So hopefully a lot more to come on this topic, and you'll actually hear from some of our collaborators on some of the work they've done here today. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.